All right, we're looking at the harmony of the life of Christ, and we want to come today to discuss quickly the last week. And immediately, when we think in terms of the last week, which we've already seen from the Gospels themselves, take in the narrative, that the narrative has a particular emphasis upon the events of the last week of Christ's life. Mark itself has been called a passion narrative with a long introduction. But the fact that the last 5.5 chapters, 6 chapters of the book, of 15.5, 16 chapters, is devoted to the passion of Christ, the last week. Now, even though the other Gospels are not quite as pronounced percentage-wise as that, each of the Gospels has a unique contribution. The last 3 of Matthew's 28, the last 3 of Luke's 24, and with the events after the last week, the last 4 of John's 21, or the last 3 of his first 20, are dealing with the historical events of the last week. And of course it is not only the climax, the culmination, but also the purpose for which Jesus had come. And so therefore the gospel writers concentrate upon this time period. Now, 2 issues are dealt with as far as background to the last week are concerned. And that is the year of Christ's death, which we've already wrestled with. That if you believe, as we do, the duration of Jesus' ministry, public ministry, was 3.5 years, then when that ministry began, and the debate between the 26 to 29 being the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar in Luke chapter 3, will determine for you, what year you see the year of Christ's crucifixion. And then preparatories we talked about on Wednesday to how you're going to see the chronology of particularly Paul and his conversion, how that relates to the 3 and 14 years that are spoken of in Galatians 1 and Galatians 3. So all of that enters into, the year of Christ's death, and by and large among conservative men today who hold a Friday date for crucifixion, which is the majority position, is either AD 30 or AD 33, is argued for the year of Christ's death. But before you can really answer the year of Christ's death, you have to answer the question that we put as excursus 4, and that is the day of crucifixion. On what day did Jesus die? And with the works that I have recommended to you, from the chart, you can see that the first 2, Thomas and Gundry, and Hona's chronological aspects of the life of Christ, though arguing a little differently, both come to the same conclusion that the crucifixion took place on Friday. And this has been the almost universal opinion of the church from the 5th century on. That the crucifixion took place on our Julian calendar once that was established. Actually, in the 6th century, the Friday was the day of crucifixion. Everyone would agree the Passover lamb was slain on Nisan 14. That is, for some, between 3 to 5, the going down of the sun, the late afternoon before darkness fully engulfed the land to then, when the majority of Jewish reckoning would say you are into another day. But Nisan 14 would be the day, and even if the reckoning was changed from midnight to midnight, you're still dealing with Nisan 14, and that is viewed on the Julian calendar to be a Friday. But throughout church history, and I have used the two outstanding evangelical writers that everyone goes back to who doesn't hold a Friday position, the argument in Graham Scroggy's work on the Guide to the Gospels, where he argues for a Wednesday date of crucifixion, and then B.F. Westcott's classic commentary on John and his introduction to the Gospels, where he argues for a Thursday crucifixion of Jesus. And as I said, these two opinions continue to have some who continue to follow them. Well, the crux of the argument, and hone it in chronological aspects, as he goes through the different arguments, says that, at roots, when all is said and done, the debate on the day of Christ's crucifixion really is foundational to your understanding of Matthew chapter 12, verse 40. Matthew 12:40. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now, this has been traditionally understood by the Jewish statement found within Jewish literature quite extensively, that a part of a day equals the day. So that to say 3 days and 3 nights is equal to 3 days, and any portion of a day was considered a day. So if the resurrection takes place on the first day of the week, as seems to be implied by Matthew 28 and Mark 16, etc., then you're into the first day of the week, which on the Julian calendar is Sunday. That is part of day 1 that you go back. Saturday would be day 2, and then the crucifixion taking place on Friday afternoon, with burial taking place before sunset, would be day 3. The arguments is that even though when you're talking about a day, Jewish tradition says a part of a day is to be considered as the whole, that idiomatic understanding does not relate to when specifically 3 days and 3 nights are spoken about. That now you are talking about 12-hour periods, day, night, or a portion of same. Now the problem is, there is no way with extra biblical literature that you can argue one way or the other on that. The concept of 3 days, 3 nights, part of a day, part of a night, standing for the whole day, the whole night. But Scroggy is very dogmatic on the fact that you are dealing with a 72-hour period here. 3 days, 24 hours each. So that if Jesus was crucified and buried on the afternoon of the first day, and you got to appreciate this for Scroggy, he is raised from the dead exactly 72 hours later. Now we know that he wasn't resurrected on Sunday afternoon, because the resurrection appearances take place on first day morning. But Scroggies' assumption is that Jesus was physically resurrected before his appearances, and that took place sometime on our calendar Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening. Then it's based upon whether you're going to get into, the day beginning at evening or a day beginning at midnight, where you follow the Jewish or the Roman reckoning as far as the day. So for Scroggie, basically Jesus is buried 72 hours. And since he wasn't raised on Sunday, he was raised on Saturday. Okay, the first day goes back to Friday, second day to Thursday, third day to Wednesday. Then what he does with a Wednesday crucifixion is that he then places the events, and what is true about both Scroggie and Westcott to hold their positions is that Passover occurs after or at the same time as the crucifixion. That is, the Last Supper was not a Passover meal. It was not Jesus and his disciples eating the Passover. Well, my problem with Scroggie and my problem with the Wednesday position is just that what they all state. You have a Saturday resurrection. That you've got Jesus basically being raised 12 hours before any resurrection appearance is given. And the Gospels seem implicitly to be saying that there is a close correlation between the actual resurrection and the resurrection appearances. So Matthew 28:1, now late on the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave, and behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for the angel of the Lord had descended, came, rolled away the stone, etc. And the angel's appearance that goes on. But they're coming to the tomb. And it is here they're given the word that Jesus had risen. And Mark in 16:1, when the Sabbath was over, the Sabbath day was complete. Very early, verse 2, on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb. And wondering how the stone was going to be rolled away, they saw that the stone had been rolled away. And again, the Lord who has been crucified is not here. The place where he was laid, he is risen. Go tell his disciples. Now, Scroggie's position is, again, that resurrection took place hours before the women got to the tomb. It took place on a Saturday. And he has to do that because he's making 3 days and 3 nights be literally 3 complete days, 3 complete nights. Now, Westcott is not going to be that precise. All he's going to say is the part of a day, part of a night is all that is necessary for the Matthew 12:40 passage. And so he will say, okay, arguing back from Sunday, all right? Sunday, all right, he is raised before daylight. So Saturday nights, Friday nights, Thursday night, he's in the tomb. And he doesn't have to be in the tomb all the way until, that night is over, that darkness is over. He was raised toward the dawning as the new day was appearing. And then as far as daytime is concerned, all right, he is put in the tomb before sunset on Thursday. That's day 1. He's in the tomb on daylight Friday, day 2. He's in the tomb daylight Saturday, day 3. And so he argues for the Thursday crucifixion. Now, I am completely convinced of the Friday crucifixion, but I would say that if I wasn't, I think the argument is stronger for Thursday than Wednesday. But be that as it may, I'm not going to give the options. Here's 1, here's 2, here's 3. But if I was an option man, it'd be 1, 2, 3. But I think that the text is clear. Now, you can't argue either way on Matthew chapter 12. Because, no pun intended, at the end of the day, we don't know whether that's an idiomatic or literal statements. No one can prove it one way or the other. Because that specific statement is not made within Jewish literature. But certainly within the Gospels themselves, we do have an indication that is very much dependent upon the understanding that day, where the biblical text makes it clear that Jesus was raised up on the 3rd day. For instance, Matthew 16:21, Jesus himself said that he was to be killed and raised up on the 3rd day. Now, in Jewish understanding, and truly when you start talking about days, they were inclusive, and the 3rd day was any part of a 24-hour period that was literally the day after tomorrow. So if I was to say, and it's very good, we're having this discussion on Friday, if I was to tell you with that understanding that the 3rd day means the day after tomorrow, that I want to see you again in this classroom for this class on the 3rd day, and I just left it at that, what day should you be back in this classroom? Sunday. Because the 3rd day is the day after tomorrow. Today is Friday, tomorrow is Saturday, the 3rd day is Sunday. All right, now, you got one verse, Matthew 12:40, talks about 3 days, 3 nights. You've got multiple verses that speak about Christ being raised on the 3rd day, which we know from Jewish literature is very, very clearly the day after tomorrow. Well, then, what do we do if we have Friday? The other sticky wicket is the Passover. Now, it is true that each one of the synoptics speaks about Jesus telling his disciples that he wants to eat the Passover with them. Take a look at Luke 22:13. Verse 11. Well, verse 11, then verse 13. This is where he is commanding Peter and John to go in to town to prepare. In fact, verse 8, go prepare the Passover for us that we may eat it. Eat what? The Passover. Verse 11. They say, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Verse 13, Luke's narrative, they departed and found everything just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. Verse 15, Jesus now is with his disciples in the upper room. I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I shall never eat it, the Passover, again until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Now, those who take a Passover position, camp on verse 15. I've earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you. Sorry to say I won't be able to, but I really wanted to. But you can't say he desired. At this point, he's saying, I desire to have this Passover, and I'm eating it with you. Everything else within the context says, this is the Passover. And I'm never going to eat it, the Passover, again. Assuming I'm eating it now with you until the kingdom of God comes. But Westcott, a great exegete on John's Gospel, says, well, what do you do with John chapter 18? Here's the argument for the meal being non-Passover. Because in chapter 18, verse 28, the Jewish leaders refused to go in the praetorium the next morning after the Last Supper, that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. And so Westcott argues this is not the Passover. And then this gets into astronomical charts and everything else that would say that if you're going to deal with a 30 AD calendar, basically your Passover, like here, is going to be eaten on Thursday night and Friday. So these men have not yet eaten the Passover. And so the Passover is going to be Thursday evening at the same time when the crucifixion of Jesus takes place. So he's using, again, some extra biblical evidence to say, all right, to use our basic time sequence, he goes along with the tradition on that, being around AD 30. Well, there is, the only time can be Thursday into Friday. And that is a time where not only they're going to eat the Passover, but then later on, Paul will say in 1 Corinthians 5 that Christ, our Passover, has died, suffered, at the time when the Passover lambs. Well, there's been two arguments against Westcott's understanding. The first is that Pascha here doesn't mean Passover per se, but means the whole Passover period heading into unleavened bread. And so they wanted to make sure that they were clean for eating the rest of the Passover. D.A. Carson argues for that in his commentary on the Gospel of John. Hoehner, in chronological aspects and a chart, and the page isn't listed here, but House gives you this chart on the reckoning of the Passover based upon Hoehner's chronological aspects of the life of Christ, where he tries to argue that there were two calendars in use at the time of the New Testaments. And though we know that there was a debate between the Sadducees, who controlled the temple, and the Pharisees, we don't have enough evidence to say that there were debates upon certain things that took place within the temple, that we don't have enough information to state precisely that they were debating the exact time of when the Passover lambs were to be offered. But supposedly, according to Hoehner, that the reckoning used by Galileans and the Pharisees was taking a basic midnight to midnight approach, so that the whole day, Nisan 14 is on Thursday, and then Nisan 15 is after midnight on Friday, whereas the Jews were using a sunset to sunset, the Sadducees, and so their Nisan 14 was in the afternoon of what was a day later than the Galilean reckoning. Hoehner has been pretty much disagree with by most New Testament exegetes, as saying he's read way too much into the Jewish extra-biblical literature to come to this understanding. But House goes ahead and gives you the chart so you can know the argument. I would say certainly the New Testament states that Jesus did keep the Passover. Passover was that he ate was slain on Thursday, and we know that the religious leaders of Israel were really punctiliar in their acceptance and following of the Old Testament. No, they're not. They were much looser. So there is a very, very real possibility that there could have been some looseness on the part of the Sadducees on this, or Carson might be right, that they're talking about defiling themselves from the rest of the feast and not the Passover itself. But with all of that being stated, and for John, as he uses the term Pascha, he uses the term Passover, certainly seems to be dealing with the events that are going to take place on Friday, and that is going to impact the last week, because with an inclusive reckoning in John chapter 12, what we find out in verse 1 is that 6 days before the Passover. And if the Passover is Friday afternoon, 6 days before it on inclusive reckoning would be Sunday afternoon. And so a place where I will follow Honer is on the fact of Jesus when he comes to Bethany. I guess you might say here is the Essex non-traditional point, and by the way, Scroggie and Honer also argue with the traditional approach, having a silent day that they believe on the basis of Matthew 26 cannot be supported. That 2 days before the death, the events in the temple come to an end. Judas goes and betrays Jesus. And so that's 2 days before, and 2 days before would make that Wednesday and not Tuesday. I would argue it a little differently. That to have Christ's entry into Jerusalem be on a Monday, on a Sunday, means that Jesus, because he comes to Bethany the night before, must have been very, very close to get to Bethany after sunset to have the triumphal entry the following day. That if he was following the scruples of the Jewish understanding of the law, remember, from sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday, he could only travel, about a quarter of a mile. Any further than that would be rest, would be work on a day in which he should be resting. There, I think, for it is better to say that his arrival in Bethany 6 days before the Passover on John's reckoning is that he arrives 6 days before, which is Sunday. That is the night of the supper and the crowds, and the triumphal entry is on Monday. And there is no silent day. That my listing then of events just follows the harmony, except it's 1 day in advance until you get to Thursday. So that my notes don't reflect a silent day. Now, I may be wrong. I wouldn't go with the stake for my conclusion, but I think it is the best understanding of what we have in John's Gospel, and Jesus following not only the law, but also the traditions of the Jews at that point as well. Over the years, when you write your synopsis, I realize I convince almost no one concerning that. and you won't get graded down if you take Dr. Thomas's viewpoint. It is the traditional viewpoint on he arrives in the triumphal entry. His entry into Jerusalem is on Sunday. That's why we have Palm Sunday on our calendars. Again, when the Julian calendar was put together, that was the earliest tradition of the church with the silent day. So Dr. Thomas has all the church tradition going for him. I just have the exegesis of John chapter 12. I'm joking, of course. Going for me. But be that as it may, I'm at least lean this way. I wouldn't be dogmatic, but I lean this way, and I've got to write the notes on my understanding of what I think the Bible is saying. But that is the only difference. The other events that take place from Sunday to Tuesday in the traditional reckoning, I'm just putting from Monday to Wednesday on my reckoning. And then from then, you get in the events, and I'm using here, just as the harmony, I'm using a midnight to midnight, since the Julian calendar is what we're dealing with as far as these days, because certainly it gets tricky on Thursday and Friday, because it's around midnight where Jesus is arrested in Gethsemane, and that is early Friday in our reckoning. But during the rest of the nights, when the trials of Jesus take place that lead to his crucifixion during the daytime of Friday. And so we have the actual crucifixion, where Jesus about 9 o'clock in the morning is placed upon the cross. And then at about noon you have the darkness is on the land for 3 hours. And then you have Jesus giving up his breathing his last, giving up his spirit, dying at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with the burial taking place between 5 to 6 that evening. Another argument sometimes is brought up is that there's so much that has to take place from the actual death of Christ to his burial. But really, in the end, when you see what was done and was already prepared, 2 or 3 hours is enough time to satisfy the events around the burial of Jesus. That is, with Pilate sending the troops to find out that the men were, to find out Jesus was dead, to smash the knees of the other men so that they would die. The request of Joseph of Arimathea for the body, which actually could have been given before Jesus actually died, his release of the body to Joseph of Arimathea, and the wrapping, but not the spices, and the rolling of the tomb. That was all given. By the way, by the third day, by Saturday, a seal is asked from Pilate, because according to Matthew 28, the Jewish religious leaders said, the scoundrel said that he would be raised on the third day, so can we have the tomb sealed to stop anyone from stealing the body? Of course, it didn't stop the rolling of the tomb, the stone, the resurrection, but Matthew 28 does say, but the story that was given by paying off the soldiers by the high priests, by the Sanhedrin, was the fact that the disciples came and stole the body of Jesus.
With that passage you just referred to, where the Jews went and requested of Pilate that the legs be broken, because in that passage it says they wanted the bodies to be taken off because it was about ready to become the day of preparation, the day before the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. So that would kind of screw up his chronology of it being Thursday.
He would deal with that. The other argument comes down on whether Sabbath was used for the Passover day, because it's a day of rest, a day when no labor was done. But Sabbath is used continually throughout the Old Testament and Jewish literature for the seventh day. That these feast days when no when no work was done was not referred to technically by Sabbath. They were just feast days when this took place. And then there's a Sabbath within the time of the feast. So that would be his argument, is it was a special Sabbath. The argument for the Friday position is there's no such thing within Judaism of special Sabbaths. The Sabbath is we believe, traditional calculations from 6 o'clock on Friday to 6 o'clock on Saturday. That is the Sabbath. So if you're right, if you're on the day of preparation for the Sabbath, we've got to get ready to keep the Sabbath. All right, that would again argue for Friday crucifixion and the burial taking place before the complete darkness of that Friday night. Okay? Because with the complete darkness, you're then into the Sabbath. But that's the argument. The argument is it's a special Sabbath. It's the Friday, it's the Passover Sabbath, not the regular weekly Sabbath.
Those who hold to Jesus coming into Bethany on Saturday, he did just say that he would not submit to Jewish law.
Either that, he was close at hand. In other words, he'd come to the outskirts of Bethany, and then came the final distance to the house. In other words, all John 12 is saying is he came to the house. He came to Bethany where Lazarus was, and they made a supper. That basically he was very, very close to Bethany. He was on the outskirts of Bethany, and then just made a journey once the darkness had come. Because you wouldn't make, coming up from Jericho is considered a 2-day trip. That's why you have the inn of the Good Samaritan story. There was an inn about halfway between Jerusalem and Jericho. You're coming up approximately 25 miles from Jericho to Jerusalem, and you're going up 5,000 feet. So that 20 miles was considered a day's journey on the level max 15 to 20. So that was viewed as a 2-day journey. All right, so the position, even my position, has to have him on the inn to keep the Sabbath, and then making the rest of the journey from that inn on the Sunday to get there Sunday evening. The traditional position would say, well, he came up Thursday and Friday, and then was in the environs, maybe within a Sabbath day's journey, of the house of Lazarus. Then he literally comes into the town and into the city. Or Hona says, even after sundown. I mean, you would make a day's trip after sundown, which just wasn't done in those days. But a short trip could have been done after sundown. So that's the approach that is taken by those who get him into Bethany on Saturday. In other words, he didn't travel until after sundown was over, and then just made a short trip. Have the crowds, then on Sunday you have the triumphal entry. And Hona, who doesn't take that position, still sees him as within the environs, and then coming and having the supper, and then and the supper being that night, then a day, and then the triumphal entry on Monday. Brian.
Just trying to figure out how to frame this. There's some people who hold the claim that the Sunday needs to be silent in order for Jesus to take care of some of the preparations, such as preparing for the room for the Last Supper and those type of things. So I guess that falls on the side of...
You mean a silent Sunday or silent Wednesday?
Wednesday.
Wednesday, right.
So
silent,
because
right.
They believe that there's all those kind of preparations that need to take place.
That's the argument.
Okay.
That he's done in the temple on Tuesday, goes back to Bethany, and yes, the Wednesday is both where Judas goes to the priests, and Wednesday is when the preparations are made by Jesus, although everyone agrees that he doesn't send the disciples in. But he's prepared with the man, the owner, so that when the disciples go in, they can be shown the upper room, preparing the room for the supper. I would say that in both cases, it still could be concluded on Wednesday afternoon, And Thursday morning would be enough time for both of those events to take place in preparatory for a Thursday evening Passover meal being participated in. Certainly, Jesus would have to have, because this was a familial meal, so that the head of a family would have a lamb slain at the temple in the afternoon and then bring it back to a home to eat the Passover lamb that evening. So Jesus does not only have to make arrangements for the room and everything being prepared, he also has to, because he is the leader, as it were, of the flock of his disciples, that he is also responsible for making sure that there is a sacrifice, a lamb at the temple to be slain by the priest, so the lamb might be brought back to eat as well. And that's where that all comes into, with so much that has to be done. Did all that take place from basically sunup on Thursday to mid-afternoon? You're really dealing from, about 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. All those preparations have to be taken care of. Silent Day also allows Judas to slip away from the disciples, not being noticed, because they're not getting ready for the Passover specifically that day, to go and make his deal with the chief priests. Yeah, it'll all make better sense when we get to heaven, but I would say no. I think I think with about 6-7 hours during the day on Thursday, all those events could have taken place. It's an argument from silence on both ends. I mean, do you need the extra day or don't you? And I'm not sure we can resolve the issue with our present state, of knowledge. Certainly he dies. Everyone agrees on that. He's buried. Everyone agrees on that. Everyone agrees that he is in the tomb on Saturday. Even Scroggy, till late Saturday afternoon, has him in the tomb. And then we have the resurrection. And what I did, because the resurrection is so important, is on that first Sunday in our reckoning, from midnight to midnight, 5 resurrection appearances are noted within the New Testament. And then from the rest of the 40 days that Jesus was upon the earth, I know the last 5 of the resurrection appearances too. So this is all in Thomas and Gundry, but what I did was just basically isolate them out so you could understand the appearances made in one day. So from the day of resurrection, from the dawn on the dawning of the daylight on Sunday, that by that evening 5 times Jesus has appeared to different individuals. And notice, of course, that is all in and around Jerusalem, and then his future resurrection, then other resurrection appearances take place, we believe, 6 through 9 in Galilee, and then his final appearance in Jerusalem when the ascension takes place. So the 40 days he was appearing to his disciples could take place both in Jerusalem and then later on in Galilee as well. But just in case you ever ask, well, what specifically were the 10 resurrection appearances of Jesus? There they are, listed out for you in the notes. All right, and so we culminate and end our discussion of how harmonistically to put together the life of Christ. Now, at this point, this is not the class on the life of Christ that Dr. Thomas offers. If you want to take quizzes on every aspect of the life of Christ, Dr. Thomas has them for you in that elective. As I said at the beginning, my only concern is that with a broad survey, as we've gone over the Gospels, that at least broadly you can think through the life of Christ, and at least you've made your first acquaintance with the harmony, so that as you get into later discussion and people in your congregation will ask you questions on how the life of Christ fits together, that at least you have some basic notes And I ask you, rather than memorizing these things, just to take the notes and the harmony and on a synopsis, and you could do it this weekend or next weekend before it's due. Just think through, and rather than outline form, just basically write a kind of a consecutive written, document that shows me that you've thought through at least the highlights of the chronology of the life of Christ and the harmony of the life of Christ. That's all I'm asking for. It doesn't have to be precise down to the last day, except for the last week. At that point, do tell me, what your conclusion is on well, I was going to say Sunday or Monday. For some of you, you might not be convinced on the Friday crucifixion. So if not, I've given you the chart where you can put together your last week, and if you can substantiate your point of view, it's going to be kind of hard on the page, but if you can substantiate it, then that's all that I'm looking for. That you have thought through the material and at least come to at this point, at least a broad understanding of the flow of the events in the life of Christ. That's what I'm looking for on the synopsis papers. All right, any further questions on the life of Christ before we...
Thomas and Gundry on page 257, section 253, he titles it Appearance to the 10 Assembled Disciples. And then if you turn to the next page, he has Mark 16 as one of the parallels, but it specifically says the 11 disciples.
You're right. Well, I've already talked about Mark 16 and my viewpoint. I think it is taking from other events. I would agree that the first account is to the 10 because Thomas wasn't present, and then in a week later, John chapter 20, you have the appearance to all 11. And it seems as though that is the appearance that he is speaking about, because it's interesting. He says he reproached them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who had seen him after he had risen. That seems to be a telescoping of what took place on the first night and the second night, the first and second appearance. Because certainly what you have is there's no reproach that takes place in John chapter 20, with the 10. It just appears to them. But Mark brings up, he reproaches all 11. But in John, it is Thomas who is reproached for not believing. Now, of course, that gets into the whole discussion on whether, Mark 14 was part of the original, 14 was part of the original gospel or not. But he seems at this point to have telescoped the two events. I think that's why Thomas and Gundry put it under the first appearance rather than the second. But you're right, when it talks about appearing to all 11, that is the second appearance in John chapter 20. So Mark has its own problems, and of course those of us who have reservations about it being a part of Scripture would say, well, here's a point where all is taking place, and the summary is what's in other canonical gospel accounts and Acts is being kind of telescoped together to bring a conclusion to Mark's gospel. All right, any other questions?
I think last week you mentioned that the harmony has been really helpful to you. You use it a lot in preparation. How do you use this in your preaching? Do you try and set the context when you come to a particular passage of kind of where he is in his ministry, or what do you do?
No, because I've never done a series on the life of Christ. I don't preach the life of Christ, I preach a particular gospel. What I meant by that is that the harmony has been very helpful to me as a tool to bring reminder of exactly, as I'm dealing with this paragraph in this gospel, what its relationship is to the life of Christ. Helping me also to conclude on whether I've got a real parallel passage in another gospel or not. And Eric is nodding his head because of the discussion we had yesterday in Luke's gospel, where the harmony has been very much a part of my understanding of Luke's last journey. So, in preaching, I exposit the passage that is before me in the gospel I'm preaching. One of my mentors, who's now with the Lord, Dr. S. Lewis Johnson, was a great preacher on not just the Gospels, but the life of Christ. And certainly to do what he did. And I heard him preach on both the baptism of Christ and the temptation of Christ. And it wasn't a particular gospel. He was dealing with the event. And what does the Bible say about this event? And it's what happened and its meaning and what can we learn from it. And he was literally, preaching from a harmony at that point. In other words, he was using all of the records to give a full statement of historically what took place and what we can learn from it. And some of those messages are in BibSac editions back in the 50s and 60s. You can get them, and he was very heavily influenced by G. Campbell Morgan's The Crises of the Christ. So if you would want to preach a series on the life of Christ, I would certainly recommend Morgan's book to you. Not for every last conclusion in Morgan's book, but in a way in which you can go through and highlight the major events. And certainly at that point you're going to use a harmony, because you got to bring material from the different Gospels together, and certainly having it before you as a harmony is very important. But I think more for me is, as I've gone through the individual Gospels, to become better acquainted with how this fits in to the grand scope of how everything fits together within the life and ministry of Jesus. Another book that, although he takes the 4-year ministry, not 3-year ministry, but Stanley Ellison's book on parables, I'm trying to remember the title of the book now, In the Eye of the Storm, very much puts the parables in their historical context based upon a harmonistic reading of the Gospels, so that the parables themselves are part of the historical development that is taking place in Jesus' ministry. And he uses that to really exposit what he thinks is the meaning of the parables in their chronological sequences they actually were given within the life of Christ. And I have found that to have some tremendous insights as far as understanding the parables. So that again is based upon a harmony. I don't study a passage without having the harmony from the Gospels, having the harmony in front of me, just to keep my mind well in focus on where this takes place in the life of Christ, as well as where this takes place literarily within the flow of this given gospel. But in the end, I preach the gospel, not the life of Christ. And I preached both Mark and John, and basically did not use parallel passages at all. I stayed within the gospel. So the help has been more in my own understanding of the flow of Christ's life. It hasn't been so much what I have then taken to the pulpit to preach. Now some of you are an advantage to me. We're almost at break time, but because you have heard Dr. MacArthur week by week on the Gospel of Luke. How many of you have here and listened to him week by week? Good, a quorum. All right. Well, I know he's in 12. He's been in 12 for a while. Luke 12. I've stayed up on what he's been preaching, but in the messages that I have heard, when I've either been here or I have heard him preach on Luke outside the context, I have not heard Dr. MacArthur doing a whole lot of cross-referencing to the other Gospels. Now, those of you who heard him week by week, is he preaching Luke or is he preaching the life of Christ? He does cross-reference some. But would you say he's preaching Luke or is he preaching the life of Christ? That's what I thought. He might. I think anyone at times. I mean, feeding the 5,000. You bring up that that's in all the Gospels. And at certain times, certainly where he is now in Luke 11 and 12, at times he'll have to say, did this take place at Galilee, or is this a separate occurrence that's taking place on the road to Jerusalem? He'll have to make some statements to that way, which obviously will deal with cross-references. But he is preaching Luke. He's preaching what Luke reveals concerning Christ. And Luke's statement of the event. And Luke's narration of what Christ said at this time and what it means and what its application is to us. So I would say, gentlemen, that's why I would do it too. Preach the gospel as the gospel, and bring in other material only as necessary to explain and answer questions that people might have as how does this relate to what's in another gospel. But preach the gospel as the gospel. Now we're going to enter into our discussion of the epistles and Revelation. And each one of the letters, and remember that Revelation begins also in an epistolary format. It's going to have a very, very unique body compared to the other letters, obviously, but first and foremost, even the book of Revelation was written to the 7 churches of the Roman province of Asia that are enumerated. We'll look at that when we get there. But that these books in the New Testament are taking what we have looked at in the Gospels and Acts and now relating that truth concerning Jesus to the life of Christian believers. That every one of these letters is either for a church or for a community of believers, either an individual church or a wider group of believers. But they're all written and directed toward Christians. All right, to get into the background of this now, we need to realize that we really broaden our perspective away from the Jewish background that is so vital for the Gospels in the first 12 chapters of Acts, and realize now that these letters are addressed to believers from throughout the Roman Empire. And even though some letters, like James, will be particularly to Jewish believers, they are Jewish believers in the dispersion, that live not in Palestine, but live within the Roman Empire, and some also could be beyond that. So that as we come to the letters in Revelation, we have to think through first the historical and then the literary and social background, as we did for the Gospels and Acts. And the Roman Empire was established by Octavian and the Roman Senate in 27 BC. Before that, we have the time that was known within Roman history as the Roman Republic. But what took place, and on pages 48 and 49, you do have I'll just put it over here, a chronological history of Rome. that in much the same way as we saw with the chronological history of both Greece and then the events within the land of Israel itself, from the first deportation to the return of the Jews and the whole post-exilic period through AD 70 and beyond, House has done the same thing for you as far as the history of Rome is concerned. He begins with the founding of Rome in 509 BC, and the founding of the Republic of Rome, and chronologically brings you through the major events in Roman history. And the events we want to particularly look at are the conquests of Rome that made the different geographical areas to which the church went, and the gospel went, therefore the church established, and then letters written, to understand something of how these areas were incorporated within the Roman Empire. And I will use some of the maps that are in the Holman Bible Atlas to think through and fill in the notes that are before you. All right, here is the Roman conquest of 300 to 100 BC. All right, basically, Rome emerges as a city and takes over the whole Italian peninsula and the islands of the Mediterranean. Particularly in the period right around 200 BC, they're involved with the wars with Carthage that will give them a foothold in North Africa and start to give them the foothold along the southern coast, the southwestern coast of the Mediterranean. More important to us, and we've already talked about in 190 BC, that as the Seleucids were trying to move their power toward the east, toward the west, Rome has to move toward the east. And in 190 BC, defeats Antiochus the third, and yet at this point just allows for a heavy tribute rather than at this point sending in its troops and taking this area. In the meantime, in this period, they begin to move against the Grecian peninsula. In 168 BC, they begin the annexation of Macedonia and make it into a province by 148 BC. They also move against what will become Achaia. And they control Achaia under the influence, the leading city of Corinth. There is a rebellion against Rome, so that in 146 BC, Corinth is completely, Greek Corinth, destroyed in the same way as Carthage. You rebel against Rome, Carthage, Corinth, and later on, same thing will take place as far as Jerusalem is concerned. Rome just completely comes in and obliterates the city. To show you lead a rebellion against Rome, this is what awaits you. But by the period of approximately 140 BC, Macedonia and Achaia are established as Roman colonies. Then moving into the period from 100 BC to approximately the birth of Christ, and just a little later on, we continue to see Rome expanding. In the Roman province of Asia, 133 BC, all right, is bequeathed to Rome. and Rome establishes the province of Asia. And of course, this is the area that is spoken about. Let me zoom in here. As we come to the Aegean Sea, all right, here's Achaia, here's Macedonia, and by 133 BC, Rome has incorporated and made this into a province as well. And then through the events that take place with the dying Seleucid monarchy, they will make Syria theirs, bring their legions in to Antioch. Three legions will ultimately be stationed in Antioch, and this area of Syria will become a province. It's from Antioch in 63 that Pompey comes and conquers Jerusalem. And of course, rather than establishing at this point a Roman province, as you remember from the history we've already discussed, we have the establishment of a client kingship here by Rome. It is only a little later on that they start to move into the central section of Anatolia, of modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor. And what they do is amalgamate and bring together a number of different territories into the Roman province of Galatia by 25 BC. So that actually Palestine becomes Roman under a client king, actually before the province of Galatia is brought together as a Roman province. Now, it is very important, and another map that is here that you can see by color is the fact that with the establishment of the empire, that we have some very distinct differences as far as provinces are concerned. So what you have here in purple are provinces that were considered senatorial provinces. Provinces which had been under Rome's control the longest, and where there was a number of generations that had proven themselves to be loyal vassals of Rome. And these were territories that by and large the Roman army was no longer permanently stationed. These were senatorial provinces, that is, all of the money that flowed from these provinces, basically established during the Republic, that money flowed to the Senate, and they could use it for whatever senatorial projects that they had. With the establishment of the empire, the imperial provinces were viewed to be under the direct control of Caesar. Caesar's great, beginning with Julius Caesar and then his nephew Octavian, who is acclaimed as the first Augustus, the first emperor, that what Augustus did, because, okay, his strength was the army. The army was basically upon the frontiers and the provinces that weren't viewed as quite as responsive, a little more rebellious. And whatever came from these territories and these client states that would also pay a tribute to Rome, that was the personal funds of Augustus. So that Augustus didn't need the Senate to pay the army. Very important. The Caesar will control the army. Whoever controls the army is the one who has power as far as the empire is concerned. He's not like a president today. He doesn't have to go to the Senate to get funds. You know, today we got presidents that has to go to the Congress, and the Congress is the one that approves the budget and what he has to do. Bush and Iraq had to go and get the Congress to approve the $87 billion to, carry on the war. Well, Augustus and the Caesars after him didn't have to worry about that. Money flowed into their personal familial coffers from the imperial provinces. And so there is a distinction. Of course, by the time you get to Asia and its key city of Ephesus, and Macedonia with the key city of Thessalonica, Achaia with its key city of a rebuilt Corinth, you're dealing with senatorial provinces. Provinces where the men who come to rule are sent by the Senate. You get into to Antioch, into Egypt, and certainly into Judea under the Roman governors. Those are sent and directly answerable to Caesar himself. So this is the growth of the empire that takes place, and Rome expected total obedience to its rule, that a certain amount of freedom was allowed, but only if Rome was obeyed, and the taxes continue to flow into Roman coffers. Now I'll just list the emperors for you. You also have a chart that deals with the emperors at the time of the New Testament on pages 64 and 65 of the chart book. Also within the chart book, where the different emperors are mentioned in the New Testament is also given to you. Obviously, Augustus is mentioned in Luke chapter 2. Tiberius, we've seen, is mentioned in Luke chapter 3. Claudius, we've seen mentioned in Acts chapter 18. And Nero is not mentioned by name, but when Paul makes his appeal to Caesar, at that time the Caesar was Nero. And then when we get to the book of Revelation, and John is exiled to Patmos, early church tradition tells us it was the Emperor Domitian who did that. But Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius are mentioned by name on the pages of the New Testament. All right, so these are the emperors, and it would behoove you to get acquainted and know the names of the different emperors that ruled during the New Testament time period. These were the men who controlled the Roman army and really directed the Roman Empire during the New Testament time period. Now, with this historical and political background, we can move on into the literary works. That just as with Judaism, that we have a body of literature which emerged from the New Testament era and helps us to appreciate some of the background of the New Testament. The same thing is true when we think in terms of Roman writers. And I have broken them down into to three categories. We have the philosophical writers, Cicero, who was a couple of generations before the coming of Christ and the writing of the New Testament. Cicero in philosophy was very, very eclectic. He took a bit there, a bit here, and a bit there. His claim to fame is the fact that he was the one responsible for translating the major Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, into Latin to make the Roman philosophy available to the Latin-speaking people within the Roman Empire. He was not only one who was involved in translation, he himself became a traveling teacher. He was a writer of letters, a writer of tracts. He viewed himself as the major intellectual of his day and sought to enlighten the Romans as far as Greek philosophical thinking was concerned. And through Cicero's influence and popularization of Greek philosophical thinking, that thinking became widely known, particularly within the intelligentsia of Rome. During the New Testament era, the predominant and well-known voice within Roman philosophy was Seneca. Seneca was the advisor to Nero until Nero didn't like what he was advising and forced Seneca to commit suicide, which was the more honorable death rather than being arrested as a traitor and dying in that way. Seneca was a Stoic and basically viewed Stoicism as giving insight in how to live life. In fact, by the New Testament era, philosophy had basically become ethics. Philosophers sought to teach people how to live. And the reason for that is because, obviously, with the expansion of the Roman Empire, there were many, many ideas that had been brought in by the different peoples conquered by the Romans. There was also some digressions away from ancient Roman tradition, and Seneca became a voice of reason, of Stoic rationalism, and particularly speaking, and this is the best way to live. Two Roman historians that are very, very important, Suetonius and Tacitus. Suetonius' Life of the Caesars, Tacitus' History of the Roman Peoples. And it is through Suetonius and Tacitus that we get a broad appreciation for what was taking place among the Caesars and Rome's understanding of their history. Both make somewhat snide statements about Christianity within their works. Shameful religion that it was. Bring up that Christians really should be pitied for following such superstitions, but certainly give evidence of the fact that Christianity was known by the end of the first century within the intelligentsia of the Romans. We find out a lot about social life through the social writers, the satirists, Juvenal and Martial, Ovid, Petronius. It is through them that we find out a lot about the immorality and the social mores that were followed. It's through them we find out about the banqueting, the feasting that was taking place among, again, the higher classes of the Romans during the time when the New Testament, the first century when the New Testament was written. In fact, gentlemen, basically, if Suetonius and Tacitus were the CNNs and Fox Newses of their day, these satirical writers were the NBCs, ABCs, and NBC, or the CBSs of their day, giving us kind of an insight through their sitcoms what was taking place within broad Roman society and what was allowed and what was taking place. And we can see why Seneca was very, very concerned about the ethics of the Romans as he wrote during the first century. We might put it this way, a lot like today. A lot of people listened to Seneca and thought what he said was very, very good, but that's not what they practiced. What these writers show is that there was very, very loose ethical standards that were practiced by the Romans at the time of the New Testament. Can I put it very simply this way? The early Christians who came out of the Gentile background, that were our brothers and sisters to whom the letters of the New Testament were written, basically came out of a society much like ours. If they were to hear us complain about having to live among such rogue, immoral people, having employers that treated us like dirt and dogs, treated us like just mere property that they owned, that they could use and discard. If we would bring up the rampant immorality, the sexual mores of our day, and the blatant abortionism and flaunting of homosexual relationships that is all around us, our brothers and sisters from the first century would almost say, well, what else is new? This was exactly the moral climate of the first century, is what we face today as believers in Jesus Christ. When Paul wrote Romans 13 on obey those who have the rule over you, the emperor at the time was Nero. And certainly under Nero, even the Romans themselves realized that the empire went from bad to worse. And he was the one who was appointing most of the governors that the New Testament text was calling upon believers to obey. So these are the writers. You can go down. The Loeb series is down in the library. These are Latin authors, and you can read Seneca, you can read Suetonius, Tacitus, Juvenal, Martial, Ovid, Petronius. They're all in the library, all available for you to read and to get an appreciation of what was taking place in the Roman Empire as viewed from the Romans themselves during the first century. Along with that, in the last 125 years, archaeologically, we have found not literary works that were written for the intelligentsia, but we have found a lot of papyri. We found a lot of the letters and business correspondence. Not a lot compared to everything that was written, but compared to what we had 125 years ago, we now have a great volume of papyri. The Loeb series also has a couple of volumes of that as well. And this gives us an indication of not only just formal letters, but informal letters, family letters, letters that were written by a husband to his wife, letters that were written by business associates, business documents. We get some further idea of how life was lived, business conducted, family relationships, etc., from the papyri. We're also found from the papyri that that up until about 125 years ago, people really thought that there was a particular New Testament Greek. That we have classical Greek and then we have New Testament Greek. Well, today we know that it's Koine Greek, it's common Greek. It's the same Greek that is found in different documents within the papyri. Some obviously in Latin, some in Greek, but we find from the Greek documents that there was no particular Holy Spirit directed New Testament Greek that was only used by the writers of the New Testament. They spoke and they used language that was very much common to the eastern part of the Roman Empire during the first century. Well, a little bit about the social background that is viewed, and I'll put these up and see if I can go ahead and then put House's chart. He speaks about the Roman political system. We've already gone through this somewhat. It's not going to work. I'll have to put the whole thing there. We've already talked about this somewhat, that, all right, the Roman Empire was divided politically into the senatorial provinces and the imperial provinces, and how the imperial provinces were directly under the control of the emperor, and this is where the legions were stationed. And the legions were directly under the control of Caesar. Now, the senatorial provinces would be governed very much like a little Rome, so that under the republic, to make sure that no man gained complete and total control, there would be proconsuls that would be established, two consuls that would be elected by the Senate. Now, they could be re-elected. They could have that office a number of times. And from men who had served as consuls in Rome, the Senate would send these men to also spend a year as proconsuls directing one of these senatorial provinces. They would have the control. They would speak for the Senate over the local magistrates, and at times you would have provincial cities where the city itself would be able to have its own governmental leaders, but all, whether the local magistrates over a wider area or those over a provincial city, would answer to the proconsul for the year over the province as a whole. We run into a certain proconsul in Galileo in Acts chapter 18. He had been sent by the Senate, took up his seat in July, and would stay there for a year until he would return back to Rome and be replaced by another proconsul, a proconsul who, like Galileo, had served previously as one of the two consuls within Rome itself. So a very, very close tie-in between the Senate and the senatorial provinces. Then when we get to the imperial provinces, we find that within the system that developed under the emperor, he would have within the imperial provinces, there would be legates, or either ex-consuls or ex-praetors within Rome, who again would be given total control over a given province. And then coming down over the province would be the local magistrates and the provincial individuals. If you have a praetor, you would have a praetorian. Basically, you would have help as far as the lower governors were concerned under the major leader. And remember that Judea and Samaria were actually, it is Caesar, and then it is the legates of the Roman province of Syria, and then you have the actual governor as far as the individual province was concerned, and the local magistrates, which obviously within Judea was the Sanhedrin, And then if you had provincial cities, Capernaum would be a provincial city. It would was established as a Roman colony, and uniquely answered to Rome, unlike the other cities within Judea and Samaria. As he said, after AD 41, the legate at times could be referred to as a procurator, and have governors underneath them of the equestrian class within the provinces themselves. So this was the political system. It's the way in which Rome sought to have control over the provinces and the men that were tied in either to the Senate or as the personal representatives of Caesar that would go to the different provinces. Caesar, I've already said, was over the military system. And Rome prided itself upon its military. And in fact, the way to gain status in Rome was to serve in the military. And so for young men who wanted to rise up within the ranks of Roman bureaucracy, military service was very, very important. For those who wanted to gain favor with Rome as non-citizens, a good way to do so was to become a part of the Roman military system. In fact, the United States is not the first country to give posthumous citizenship to non-citizens who serve within our military. Rome did that as well. Everything was under Caesar. And basically what you had was the Navy, which by the time you get to the New Testament, basically thanks to the work of previous admirals, generals, that the Mediterranean had been rid of pirates. So basically the Navy was there to quickly transport Roman soldiers from one place to another. So it was a good place to serve during the New Testament because you probably weren't going to see a whole lot of battle in the Navy. It's kind of like the Merchant Marine by that point, Coast Guard, Merchant Marine. If you served in either one of those two, I'm not saying that was less than military service. I'm just trying to say that's what it had become like at this point. You have different prefects that were over the two fleets, the Tyrrhenian fleet in the west and the Adriatic fleet in the east. Caesar also had his own personal bodyguard known as the Praetorian Guard. 9,000 of the best troops that were personally responsible to Caesar directly and were his personal bodyguard, his most trusted troops, the ones that wherever Caesar went, predominantly within Rome, but other places they might establish homes, they would have guards from the Praetorian there because those were the most trustworthy troops. And then we have the first level is made up within the legions. The legions were made up of Romans, Roman citizens themselves. You have a legate over a legion of 6,000 men, a tribune that was over a cohort of 1,000 men, and then a centurion that was over 100 men. So that in the Roman army, and here is your basic, most important foot soldier, the ruler of 100, the leader of 100, and 10 of those made up the cohorts. So a cohort directed 10 centurions, and then the legion was made up of 6 cohorts, and was led by a legate who was very, very loyal, hopefully, to Caesar. And at the New Testament time period, there were 26 legions spread throughout the Roman Empire. But these weren't the only troops, because I said to be here, you had to be a Roman citizen. The Roman legions were aided by the auxiliary forces. The auxiliaries were made up of non-Roman citizens. And if you served in the auxiliary for 20 years, here was the carrot at the end of the service. After 20 years, serving as a non-citizen within a Roman auxiliary, you'd be granted Roman citizenship if you lived that long. Because the auxiliary was given some of the dirtier tasks to do as far as the Roman warfare on the frontiers. And there you have the auxiliaries. You have a Chiliarch, who was over 1,000, and then you've got the centurion that was over the century. The Roman commander in Acts 21 and 22, 23, who rescues Paul, remember, was a commander. He was over a cohort, over the centurions, and remember, he told Paul that he had become a Roman citizen. He had bought his citizenship. Want to know how much Paul had paid for his? All right, well, you could save your money. This was another way in which you become a Roman citizen. Save your money, put it in the bank, get enough money, buy your citizenship. And the Roman military, compared to the non-military people, for working your 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, as Rome demanded, the pay was fairly good for being in the military. Obviously, the centurions were paid better than the auxiliary troops were paid, and the commanders were paid better than the centurions, etc. So you could work your way up and even save up your money and get your citizenship before your 20 years of military service was done. And it was good, particularly if you could be in one of the forces that fought on the frontier, because whenever another people were conquered and the tribute came to the general and Caesar, they would pay a portion of that and as gifts back to the men who were in their forces. So to fight and survive was very lucrative. Not only did you get your monthly, or actually it was a yearly stipend, but if you could be involved in conquering another people to which tribute came to Rome, you got a cut of the proceeds. So you could see why the benefits for both Romans and non-Romans alike serving in the military. It was honorable service. It was a way you could show your loyalty to Rome and also find yourself gaining prosperity through that. And then a third thing, where we'll have to end the day, is the structure of Roman society. Just two things I want to say about Roman society. Number one, the Roman Empire, power, prominence, wealth was centered in Roman cities. That Rome itself was a city empire. And in the different provinces, Rome did give preference to ancient cities that were loyal to them, like in Ephesus, or ultimately would reconstitute a city along Roman lines like it would do in Philippi and Rome. So the wealth flowed into the cities and from the cities. If you wanted to be wealthy, you would live in a city. If you wanted prominence, position, you would be a city dweller. Now, none of the apostles of Jesus had been city dwellers. They came from Galilee. But when God chose an apostle to use to preach the message to Gentiles and to impact the Roman Empire, he chose a man who'd been born and reared in a Roman city, Tarsus, a city that Rome had made into one of their free cities. A man who was very, very acquainted with city life, city thinking. It's a lot like today. Hey, last weekend, the first thing I want to do is get out of Boston. It's like Los Angeles. Big, ugly. Oh, sorry about that. Bad, ugly in the sense of traffic. Just get out there in the wide open spaces. But you know what? You know where all the money is? It's not in the wide open spaces. It's in Boston and the other big cities. And what do people who grow up on farms, what do most of them end up doing? Moving from farms to what? City. Same thing was true in the Roman Empire. All right, so the structure of society was city dwellers had prominence over those who lived in rural areas. It's just the way it was. And the second thing is that the Roman Empire was a hierarchy of patron-client relationships. You knew exactly where you were on the pecking order. The ultimate patron was the emperor. He had his clients. Client did his bidding. And basically that's what the client's job was. The client's job was to do whatever he could for his patron. Because if the patron was successful, then he himself could be lifted up. Now the interesting thing is that where you landed on the scale, you were both patron and client. You're telling certain people what you want of them, while other people are telling you what they want of you. Even the slaves who are non-citizens developed their own patron-client relationships. There was even a pecking order among the slaves. You know, I'm a slave, but I'm the head slave. You're to do what I tell you to do. Well, who do you answer to? Well, I answer to my master. And you only answer the master, but you answer the master through me. So if you want to get along with the master, you do what I tell you to do. In other words, it was all tied into, if I might put it this way, who you knew and who you made to look good. It wasn't what you know, but who you know that mattered within the Roman Empire. And some of that thinking probably rubbed off on the believers who would view different apostles and different Christian leaders as maybe patrons, that they should honor more than somebody else because I'm a client to that individual. The whole concept of being submissive to authority, and what a shame it was to not respond to the authority over you, to do the bidding of your patron, was a major thought within the minds of those who grew up in the Roman Empire. So when they would hear, imitate me as I imitate Christ, Gentiles from a Roman background would think a little differently than than maybe what we would do today. And they were used to the fact that, okay, here's someone with some prestige, some authority being given to them by God. All right, I need to respond to that authority. I need to realize that what my patron wants of me, I am to do. So this is the other aspect of Roman society. It was very hierarchical, very structured. And you're either moving up or you're moving down. And you hope you're moving up. That was the goal of every person within the Roman Empire. If not for them, at least to move up so that their children and grandchildren would be higher up in the scale than when they started. And of course, the bridge that one wanted to cross was from non-citizen to citizen. And that's how Rome kept really the people in its empire very, very much under its authority. They dangled the carrot of Roman citizenship before them. You be loyal to us. There's a benefit for you at the end. And so this was Rome. And a political system, well organized, a military system, very powerful, very lucrative for people to come and join that military, and the structure, you can advance, you can move along as long as you know the right people and you keep your nose clean and do what you're told to do. Hey, not a whole lot different than corporate America today, right? Not a whole lot different than, what has emerged within our culture as well.